Welcome to session 6, willingness to be with things as they are. So the practice of mindfulness, as we've been talking about, it invites us to see things as they really are. Like we've talked about, the goal is to have no goal. It's about being instead of doing. So we want to get to a place where we can see things as they are and be okay with that and work with the reality of that and not as we imagine them to be or as we wish them to be. And so we really need to look into all areas of our lives if we're going to be doing this. And this is usually a big challenge because we have painful areas and we have areas in our lives and in our thoughts and in our emotions that we really try to avoid at all costs. And this is how you can see that a practice of loving kindness, cultivating that, can really be helpful in this sense. So all of our experiences, I want you to think of them as being able to be categorized into 3 different feeling states. There's unpleasant, pleasant, and neutral, which is neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And habitually, we really try to avoid the unpleasant and we try to hold on to the pleasant, and we tend to just kind of ignore things that we see as neutral. So in these sessions, I'm going to ask you to start exploring and sitting with things that are unpleasant, because in our lives, we often experience things that are unpleasant or stressful or painful and things that won't go away. So a formal meditation practice, it gives us the opportunity to practice sitting with the less comfortable and with the less familiar outside of these moments that are in our lives in high agitation. We get to kind of put aside a time where these things will still show up for us. Pain, stress, discomfort, boredom, whatever you're starting to hopefully experience while sitting in meditation. And you have that opportunity to sit with that and work with it and observe it in the moment. We normally fall so automatically into resistance against things that don't feel good or that we don't want to experience. And so it makes it difficult to see that the experience and the resistance that we have against it are not the same thing. And what we learn when we do look at this is exactly that the resistance against whatever's unpleasant or is hard to be with is what is making it even harder to be with and more uncomfortable. So here I have this equation: suffering equals pain times resistance. And you can think of a description of this equation as what we resist persists. So the more we bring resistance to a situation or a pain, a condition, something that we maybe really can't control, the type of reaction we have that we layer on top of it, anxiety, anger, you name it, that increases the actual suffering that we experience. And you could cycle in for the word pain here, a difficult event, a medical condition, symptoms, anything you want, really. So an example of this might be, you hurt your back. And so the inevitable struggle here would be this back pain that you're experiencing. And then you can think of when experiencing that, maybe it's an injury that you've had before. So as soon as that happens, you start to worry, am I going to be able to go to work today? Will I ever be able to go back to work? And all the things that come along with it, the tension that brings along with the anxiety, the fear, the anger. So you could imagine how that extra tension, that extra rumination and worry actually amps up the physical pain as well as the psychological pain and thus the suffering. Whereas if you're able to catch that resistance, the reaction to that back injury, and shift it and lessen the tension and all the other emotions that came along with it, you can imagine how the suffering that we experience might shift as well. So I want to highlight pain is inevitable in life. It is a constant. If we're not in physical or emotional pain right now, it's really likely that someone close to us is. So if the resistance or the worry goes up, so does the amount of suffering. That's what I really want to highlight. And if it goes down, the experience that we're having of that pain, how we experience it, we tend to experience it in a different way. It tends to lessen that suffering a great deal. So the resistance is the part of the equation that we can change, the reaction to whatever struggle we're going through. Aversion to pain is really a misplaced aversion to suffering. Ordinarily, we really don't make the distinction between pain and suffering, but there are really important differences between them. As I mentioned, pain is natural and it's a part of the experience of life. We're not going to avoid it. But the suffering piece, that's one possible response to pain. It's the way we respond, which affects how much we actually suffer. Suffering involves our thoughts, our emotions, and how they frame the meaning of our experience. So it's not always actually the pain, the condition, whatever word you wanted to substitute in there. It's not always that, but it's the way we see it and then react to it that actually determines the degree of suffering that we'll experience. Being with things as they are and working with things like resistance, it takes practice and it takes patience. But the good news is that it's not a constant. It is something that we can work with and something that we can learn to let go of, or at least soften. And honestly, when you actually start to pay attention in the way that we're talking about in our mindfulness practice, when you actually pay attention to what's going on, as we've talked about previously, your relationship to things have already changed and you'll already notice differences. So the first step, as I mentioned before, in different circumstances, is being able to recognize resistance, awareness. What does your body feel like? Where do you feel it when you're resisting or having a certain reaction? What are the thoughts that are common with resistance for you? Can you see how this resistance is flavoring your experience in a really recognizable way? But is it also separate from what's actually happening? Is there a way that you can start observing, noting the signs and signals and sensations of resistance for you specifically? And then can you start noticing where there's a separation between what's actually happening or the pain you're experiencing and then your reaction to it, your resistance to it? What is the difference between the two? Can you notice that? And then the next step is training your tolerance muscles in small ways to be willing to be with something mildly unpleasant. A way to practice this or really see this demonstrated in formal meditation is if you're sitting there and your nose begins to itch, let it itch. You're going to really want to itch it. It's going to start feeling like you have to itch it. But if you can hold on long enough, if you can just observe that and let it itch, you will discover eventually what might be revolutionary to you. The itch will actually go away all by itself. And so this is a way to demonstrate what we're trying to get at. We're trying to have experiences in which we start training our tolerance muscles to sit with something unpleasant, to watch it peak and come down the other side, and note that that is something will always change, that we will get through it. We can tolerate this mild unpleasantness and also build up our confidence that we have the ability to do so. And when you continually sit in meditation and give yourself opportunities to practice being with something mildly unpleasant and not resisting it, you become more familiar over time with what resistance actually looks and feels like to you, and you learn to tolerate it much better. And you also begin to notice more often than not, when you're just paying attention and notice the resistance, it tends to lessen significantly and maybe even dissipate altogether just by noticing it. And then lastly, this automatic reflex to resist everything you don't like will start to diminish in a lot of situations over time. Once you give yourself ample opportunity to work these muscles of being okay with being with discomfort, not always resisting, and that will become more of the norm for you and become easier. And so the guided meditation today will be mindful eating. I'll walk you through eating something small, like a raisin, a nut, a grape, anything that you have accessible. You don't have to go out and buy a raisin. I'll be using a raisin myself. But I'll walk you through really observing the texture, what you hear, what you smell, what you taste, and hopefully this will be a really different experience of eating.